Have you ever, like I have, gazed into the quiet depths of the night and wondered about the profound secrets it might have whispered to history's most brilliant minds? Well, tonight we're not just telling a story. Instead, I'm personally inviting you to gently drift with us. Let your thoughts unfurl as we embark on a journey into the utterly compelling world of Alexander the Great. Forget the stress of the day, because here we're going to discover the monumental legacy of this legendary conqueror, not through the usual clang of battle or the weight of empire, transformed, quite deliberately, into a wonderfully calming, historical reflection that's absolutely perfect for unwinding and letting your imagination roam through the annals of time. The velvet cloak of night has always held a certain allure for me, a stage upon which the grandest dramas of history have unfolded. Tonight, as the moon casts its silvery glow upon the quietude, I find myself drawn to the two whispers of destiny that swirled around a young boy destined for unimaginable glory. We speak, of course, of Alexander, son of Philip, the second of Macedon. From his earliest days, Alexander was not merely a prince. He was a vessel of his father's fervent ambition. Philip, a king who had forged Macedon into a formidable power, saw in his son not just an heir, but a continuation of his legacy, an instrument to carve an empire that would dwarf all that had come before. The air in Pella, the Macedonian capital, crackled with the unspoken weight of these grand plans. While other boys his age might have been chasing hounds or practicing with wooden swords, Alexander's world was being meticulously crafted, his mind a fertile ground being prepared for seeds of unparalleled knowledge. His tutelage was not left to chance. Philip, a man of astute intellect and strategic brilliance himself, understood that true conquest lay not just in the strength of arms, but in the sharpness of the mind. He sought out the greatest philosopher of the age, the very embodiment of Western thought, Aristotle. Imagine the scene, if you will, the rugged Macedonian court, a place of warriors and ambition. Suddenly, playing host to the gentle, probing intellect of the Stagirite. Aristotle, a man who had dissected the natural world and charted the very currents of human thought, was entrusted with shaping young Alexander. It was no ordinary education, was a forging. The young prince, already possessing a precocious mind, was a challenge and a delight to his tutor. Aristotle didn't just teach him facts. He taught him how to think. He introduced Alexander to the fundamental principles of logic, the intricacies of ethics, the marvels of the natural sciences, and the vast tapestry of history. He pored over the epics, the tales of heroes and gods, planting the seeds of ambition and a thirst for immortal fame. I can almost see Alexander, bright-eyed and restless, perched on a stool in the royal gardens, the scent of olive trees heavy in the air, as Aristotle would trace the constellations with a gnarled finger. The boy absorbed it all. The poetry of Homer, the mathematics of Euclid, the biological classifications that were so novel at the time. But it was more than just academic pursuit. Aristotle, understanding Philip's ultimate aims, also guided Alexander's strategic thinking. He would have discussed military tactics, not just as theoretical constructs, but as the application of logic and understanding to the chaos of battle. He taught Alexander to analyze terrain, to understand the strength and weaknesses of different formations, to anticipate the enemy's moves. It was a masterclass in warfare, delivered not through the harsh realities of the battlefield, but through the tempered lens of philosophical inquiry. This unique blend of intellectual rigor and strategic foresight was the bedrock upon which Alexander's future was built. While other future rulers might be steeped in courtly intrigue or the art of diplomacy, Alexander was grappling with abstract concepts, learning to dissect arguments, and to see the world through a lens of reason. This wasn't just about memorizing treaties or understanding lineages. It was about cultivating a mind that could innovate, adapt, and conquer not just lands, but ideas. Philip's ambition was for his son to be more than a king. He was to be a world changer. And so, under Aristotle's patient guidance, Alexander learned to question, to dissect, to understand the why behind things. He learned about the balance of power, the nature of governance, and the complexities of human motivation. He was being prepared not just to lead an army, but to lead a civilization, to shape the very course of human history. Even the legendary horse Bucephalus was a testament to this unique upbringing. It said that the untamable beast, rejected by all others, was calmed by the young Alexander, who observed its fear of its own shadow. This incident, often recounted, perfectly encapsulates the blend of keen observation and bold action that Aristotle was nurturing within him. It foreshadowed the man who would face down fearsome armies with a similar, unflinching understanding of their underlying nature. The whispers of destiny, therefore, were not just born of royal blood or military might. They were also sown in the fertile soil of a mind meticulously cultivated. Aristotle wasn't just a teacher. He was a sculptor, chipping away at the raw marble of princely potential, revealing the masterpiece that lay within. He equipped Alexander with the tools to not only understand the world, but to fundamentally reshape it. He instilled in him a curiosity that would drive him to the ends of the earth, and a strategic mind that would ensure his triumphs were not mere luck, but the product of profound intellect and foresight. As the night deepens and the stars begin their silent vigil, we can almost feel the echo of those early lessons, the intellectual sparks that ignited the fire of a legend, forever etched into the annals of time. This was the foundation, the crucible where a prince's ambition was forged into the sharp, unwavering edge of a prodigy. But intellect, however sharp, is a blade that must be tested. A mind forged in quiet libraries and philosophical debate must eventually face the chaotic, unpredictable nature of the world itself. The crucible Aristotle had built was one of thought. The next would be one of action, of instinct, and of a spirit that burned as brightly as any star in the Hellenic sky. Let us drift, then, from the hushed halls of Mieza to the sun-drenched training grounds of Pella. Imagine the scene. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of dry earth, leather, and the nervous sweat of men and beasts. King Philip II, my father, stands with his generals, a mountain of a man whose impatience is as legendary as his military prowess. Before them, a spectacle of failure is unfolding. A horse trader from Thessaly, a man named Philonicus, has brought a creature that seems less a horse and more a force of nature. He is a magnificent beast, a giant of a stallion, with a coat the color of polished obsidian, and a hide that ripples with muscle like a dark, flowing river. On his brow is a white star, shaped like the head of an ox, and from this he has been named Bucephalus, the ox head. But his beauty is eclipsed by his fury. He is a storm given flesh, a living embodiment of chaos. His eyes, they say, are not the soft brown of a domesticated animal, but contain a wild, bluish gleam, a shard of the untamable sky trapped within. I watch from the periphery, a youth of perhaps 12 or 13 years, still more boy than man in the eyes of my father's court. I see seasoned grooms, men who have spent their lives on the backs of horses, thrown from him as if they were mere dolls. I hear his screams, not the familiar whinny of a steed, but a raw, guttural roar of defiance that echoes off the stone walls. He rears, his hooves like hammers against the sky, biting and kicking at any who dare approach. The men are afraid. More than that, they are defeated. I can see it in the slump of their shoulders, in the way they wipe the dust and blood from their faces. They see an animal to be broken. My father's voice, a gravelly boom, cuts through the chaos. Take this mad beast away. He commands Philonicus. Macedonia has no use for a creature that values its rage over its rider. He is angry, disappointed. 13 talents is a king's ransom for a horse, and this one is proving to be nothing but a costly, violent mistake. But as the grooms move to lead the frantic horse away, something holds me fast. I am not watching the men. I am not listening to my father's frustrated pronouncements. I am watching Bucephalus, and in his wildness, I feel not a threat, but a kinship. Aristotle has taught me to observe, to look for the cause behind the effect, the logic hidden within the chaos. The others see only fury. I see fear, blinding, terrifying fear. I step forward. The movement is small, but in the tense atmosphere, it is enough to draw my father's gaze. What is it, Alexander? His tone is dismissive, the way a man speaks to a child who is interrupting the affairs of adults. It is a shame to lose such a fine horse, I say, my voice clearer and steadier than I feel, simply because these men lack the skill and courage to handle him. A ripple of laughter, quickly suppressed, moves through the generals. My father's one good eye narrows, and you believe you possess this missing skill? You, a boy who has yet to face a real battle? This is the moment, the pivot. The world seems to slow, the dust hanging motionless in the air. I see the challenge in his eye, but also the flicker of something else, a desperate hope, perhaps, that I might be more than he imagines. I do, I answer, and I will wager the price of the horse, that I can ride him where no other man can. My father scoffs, a sound like rocks grinding together. And if you fail, what does a prince wager when he has nothing of his own? I will pay the 13 talents myself, I declare, meeting his gaze without flinching. The court falls, silent. It is an absurd boast, a piece of breathtaking arrogance from a boy. But my father, ever the gambler, sees a challenge he cannot resist. Perhaps he wishes to teach me a lesson in humility. He nods, a sharp, decisive gesture. Done! Let us see this prodigy at work. I feel 100 pairs of eyes on me as I walk into the dusty ring. I do not approach the horse directly. I ignore the men, the whispers, my father's stern gaze. My world shrinks to include only myself and this magnificent, terrified creature. I speak to him not in commands, but in a low, steady murmur, the way one might speak to a frightened friend in the dead of night. I am not trying to command him. I am trying to tell him that I understand. And then I see it. The secret that Aristotle's lessons have unlocked for me. As Bucephalus shies and rears, his own shadow dances on the ground before him, a dark, distorted monster that mimics his every panicked move. He is not just fighting the men. He is fighting a phantom of his own making. He is terrified of himself. Slowly, deliberately, I take his bridle. He flinches, his muscles coiling like steel springs. But my touch is gentle, my voice a constant, calming presence. Do not pull. I do not force. I simply turn his head, gently but firmly, guiding him to face the brilliant Macedonian sun. Just like that, the shadow vanishes. It is as if a spell has been broken. The horse's panicked screams subside into a questioning snort. His body, once rigid with terror, softens. I continue to speak to him, stroking his powerful neck, letting him feel the warmth of my hand, the steadiness of my heart. There is no trickery here, no magic whip or secret charm. There is only observation, empathy, and the refusal to meet fear with force. I am showing him that I am not another shadow to be fought. After a few moments that feel like an eternity, I shed my heavy cloak, letting it fall gently to the ground. An act of trust. Then, with a fluid grace I did not know I possessed, I swing myself onto his back. There is no bucking, no fight. There is only a gathering of power, a deep breath from the horse, and then we are moving. We are not just a boy on a horse. We are one being, a living arrow launched into the wind. We gallop across the field, a blur of black and gold against the brown earth. I feel his power, the thunder of his hooves, not as a jarring force, but as an extension of my own heartbeat. It is a feeling of absolute freedom, of a perfect union between intellect and instinct. In that moment, riding the untamable, I feel as though I am touching the face of destiny itself. When I finally ride him back to the stunned and silent assembly and dismount, it is my father who steps forward. The mockery is gone from his face, replaced by an expression of profound awe and perhaps a little fear. He looks at me, truly looks at me, as if for the first time. Tears well in his eye as he pulls me into a rough embrace. He holds me at arm's length, his hands heavy on my shoulders, and his voice, when he speaks, is a prophecy that rings across the silent field. "O my son," he says, his voice thick with emotion, "look thee out a kingdom, equal to and worthy of thyself, for Macedonia is too little for thee." And as the sun begins to set, casting long shadows that no longer hold any terror, I look at the magnificent creature beside me, his muzzle now soft in my hand. He was the unbroken horse, but in his spirit I saw an unbroken world waiting. He was the first conquest, not of brute strength, but of understanding. And as you drift deeper into the night, know this, the bond forged that day between a prince and a prodigy of a horse would carry us across deserts and mountains, through battles and into legend. Bucephalus was more than my mount. He was the first, living proof that the greatest empires are not conquered, but won, one trusting heart at a time. The years that followed the taming of Bucephalus were a forge, shaping the prince into the commander. My father, having seen a spark of something beyond his own formidable ambition in me, did not shield me from the world, but thrust me into its heart. At 16, I was regent of Macedonia, while he campaigned against Byzantium. I crushed a Thracian revolt, founded a new city, Alexandropolis, and learned the brutal arithmetic of rule. I fought beside him at Charonea, leading the cavalry that shattered the sacred band of Thebes, the finest soldiers in all of Greece. In those years I tasted both the thrill of command and the bitter ash of my father's constant, looming shadow. He was proud, yes, but it was the pride of a master craftsman in his tool, not of a father in his son. We were two suns in a single sky, and the heavens were not large enough for both. The end came, as it so often does, not on a battlefield, amidst the clash of bronze and the cries of men, but in the deceptive calm of celebration. It was the wedding of my sister Cleopatra in the old capital of Aegae. The air was thick with the scent of wine and roasted meats, with the murmur of alliances being forged and old rivalries being put to rest. My father, Philip, king of Macedon, hegemon of Greece, was at the apex of his power. He walked into the theatre that day a god among men, his statue carried alongside those of the 12 Olympians. He was radiant, unarmed, a man who believed he had finally conquered his own destiny. I was walking a few paces behind him. I remember the glint of the sun on the polished stone, the hum of the crowd, then a blur of motion. A man, one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias, lunged from the crowd. A single brutal thrust of a dagger. There was a moment of stunned silence, a collective intake of breath across the theatre, as if the world itself had stopped. My father stumbled, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. He fell, and the lifeblood of Macedon began to stain the earth. Chaos erupted. Shouts, screams, the frantic movement of guards. But for me, in that maelstrom, a strange and terrible calm descended. The sky had not fallen. It had simply cleared. The second sun was extinguished. As Pausanias was cut down, trying to flee, my gaze met that of my mother, Olympias, across the pandemonium. In her eyes, I saw no grief, only a blazing, triumphant fire. The world saw a tragedy. I saw a throne, suddenly, terrifyingly empty. Before my father's body was even cold, the whispers began. The vultures of the court began to circle, smelling weakness. Rivals who had bent the knee to Philip would never bow to a boy of 20. My cousin Amyntas had a prior claim. The powerful Lyncestian brothers held sway over half the army. The Greeks to the south, chief among them the orator Demosthenes in Athens, would surely see this as their chance to shatter the chains Philip had forged. But my father, for all his flaws, had taught me that power abhors a vacuum, and Aristotle had taught me that logic is the swiftest sword of all. While others panicked or plotted, I acted. My father's most loyal general, Antipater, was the first to my side. He presented me to the army, still reeling from the shock, and with his endorsement, their grief turned to loyalty. They raised their spears and shields, and their roar of Alexander was my true coronation. It was not a crown of gold that settled on my head, but a helmet of bronze, heavy with the weight of a kingdom and the promise of an empire. The days that followed were a grim necessity, a culling of the weeds before they could choke the field. Power is a cold calculus, and sentiment is a luxury a new king cannot afford. The sons of Aeropus of Lyncestus, implicated in the plot, were executed. My cousin Amyntas, a potential figurehead for rebellion, was put to the sword. It was brutal, swift, and clean. I did not relish it, but I did not shrink from it. I was securing not just my own life, but the unity of the kingdom my father had bled to build. As you drift in the stillness of the night, understand this. A foundation built on sentiment will wash away in the first rain. A foundation of fear and respect, carved from decisive action, will stand for an age. With Macedonia secured behind me, I turned my gaze south. News had reached Athens and Thebes. Demosthenes, I was told, mocked me in the assembly. He called me a boy, a fool they could swat aside. He said I would be too busy with rituals and funerals to leave my own borders. They began to plot. to raise armies, to dream of freedom. They had forgotten the speed of the wolf. I did not wait. I gathered the army, and we moved. We did not march. We flowed down through Greece like a river in flood. We covered 240 miles in 2 weeks, a feat considered impossible. When we appeared at the borders of Thessaly, the cities that had been planning rebellion simply stared in disbelief. They submitted without a fight. The Greeks learned their first lesson about their new hegemon. I did not come when expected. I was simply there. At Corinth, I summoned the Greek states. They came, their leaders' faces a mixture of awe and resentment. They saw not a boy, but the ghost of Philip, only younger, faster, and with a colder fire in his eyes. They confirmed me as leader of the Hellenic League, granting me the armies and authority for the great venture my father had planned his entire life, the invasion of Persia. It was there, in Corinth, that I sought out the philosopher Diogenes the Cynic. I found him living in a large clay jar, basking in the sun like a lizard on a rock. Surrounded by my guards and the fawning Greek politicians, I, the most powerful man in their world, stood before a man who owned nothing. "I am Alexander the King," I announced. He squinted up at me. "And I am Diogenes the dog," he replied, without rising. Intrigued, I asked if there was anything I could do for him. He waved a dismissive hand. "Yes," he grumbled. "Stand a little out of my sun." My men gasped. The politicians paled, expecting an outburst of royal fury. But I simply laughed. It was a genuine, hearty laugh. Here was the one man in all of Greece who wanted nothing from me. He had no land to protect, no favor to ask, no ambition I could fulfill. He was completely free. As I walked away, my companions were still muttering about the cynic's insolence. I turned to them, and the truth of it struck me with the force of a revelation. "Truly," I said, "if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." That night, as I stared at the stars from my campaign tent, I understood the path ahead. I had secured my father's kingdom with blood and speed. I had bent the will of the Greeks with fear and awe. But the path to legend, the one my soul yearned for, was something more. It was the path of Alexander, a journey that even a king might envy a beggar for. The boy king's reign had begun, and before me, across the wine-dark sea, lay Asia. It was a world unbroken, waiting not just to be conquered, but to be understood. And as the night deepens around you, let your thoughts drift east, across the Hellespont, to where the real story was about to begin. The sea was not merely a body of water. It was a threshold. On one shore, the familiar world of squabbling city-states and inherited grudges. On the other, the immeasurable ancient dominion of the great king. As my ship cut through the waves of the Hellespont, I did not merely cross a strait. I severed a tie. The Europe of my father was at my back. Before me, Asia was a blank scroll, and I held the stylus. I remembered Diogenes content in his jar, and for a moment I envied the simplicity of his world. Mine was about to become infinitely, magnificently complex. The Persian satraps and their Greek mercenary captain Memnon chose their ground well. The Granicus River was not deep, but its banks were steep and slick, with spring mud. They lined the far side, a glittering, impenetrable wall of bronze, and horseflesh, their lances a forest of lethal points aimed at the sky. My generals, the old lions who had fought beside Philip, urged caution. To charge uphill against a superior force was madness. Parmenion, his voice a low rumble of experience, suggested we camp, wait, let the enemy's nerve fray in the heat. I looked at my men, not at the grizzled veterans, but at the young ones, my companions. I saw not fear in their eyes, but a raw, hungry light. They had followed a boy king across a sea for this. They did not come for caution. They came for glory. They have chosen their ground, I said, my voice carrying over the murmur of the river. But they have forgotten who holds the initiative. They stand waiting for my move. A man who is waiting is already half defeated. The plan was audacious, a gamble that would either be studied for millennia or forgotten as a bloody footnote. I would be the tip of the spear. With my companions, I would charge directly at the Persian left, at the very heart of their command. It was a feint of sheer, unbelievable arrogance, designed to draw their entire focus onto me. As the Persian cavalry surged to meet my glittering helmet and white plume, the heart of their line would thin. That was the moment. That was the opening for my father's masterpiece, the Macedonian phalanx. I kicked Bucephalus forward, and the world dissolved into a roar of water and thunder. The river was cold, shocking, dragging at the horses' legs. A storm of javelins and arrows darkened the sky. I raised my shield, the sound of impacts a violent drumbeat against the bronze. Then we were scrambling up the far bank, met not by water, but by a tide of screaming men and horses. It was chaos, a press of heat and metal and the sour smell of fear. I parried a lance thrust, felt the shudder run up my arm, and drove my Ziston into a Persian noble's throat. His eyes, wide with shock, met mine for an instant before he vanished beneath the churning hooves. This was not a battle of formations. It was a brawl of heroes, a clash of wills. I sought out the bright banners of the satraps, a beacon in the melee. To kill the leaders was to break the army's spirit. I saw Mithridates, the son-in-law of Darius, rallying his men. He saw me. Our charge met with the sound of shattering wood. My lance snapped. I drew my sword, and we fought, man to man, our horses circling. He was strong, but his movements were broad, predictable. He fought for duty. I fought for a destiny. I slipped my blade under his guard, and he fell. Another satrap, Spithridates, raised his axe behind me. A blur of motion, and Clytus the Black severed the satrap's arm at the shoulder, saving my life with a roar of fury. The loyalty of my men was not an abstract concept. It was a shield, a sword, a presence at my back, and as the Persian high command died around me, their cavalry, leaderless, began to waver. That was the signal. From the river a new sound emerged, not the chaotic din of cavalry, but the grim, relentless, earth-shaking tread of the phalanx. 16 men deep, their sarissas lowered. They advanced as a single, monstrous entity. The remaining Persian cavalry, disordered and confused, could not stand against that advancing thicket of iron points. Horses reared, throwing their riders. Men were impaled where they stood. The Granicus was not just a victory. It was a statement. It declared that the might of Persia could be broken, that a new power had arrived. As I stood on the blood-soaked bank, looking at the field of the fallen, the truth of Diogenes' freedom echoed in me. He was free from want. I was free from doubt. The path was clear. The following year, at Issus, Darius himself brought his entire court to war. He chose a narrow coastal plain, believing his overwhelming numbers would crush us. He believed he was the hunter. He was wrong. He was the canvas. He arrayed his army with the sea at our back and the mountains to our left, a colossal force stretching into the distance. His Greek mercenaries, veterans, and doughty fighters held the center, his cavalry massed on his right, near the coast. It was a formidable wall, but walls have cracks. Parmenian's men held our left against the Persian cavalry, taking a brutal pounding but refusing to break. Their unwavering sacrifice was the anchor of my plan. Meanwhile, I took my companions and the hardest of the hypaspists and began to march, not forward, but to the right, toward the foothills. We snaked along the uneven ground, outflanking the immense Persian line. We were a dagger, sliding silently along the ribs. Darius saw the movement. He panicked. He began pulling units from his center to reinforce his left, to block our advance. In doing so, he created a slight, almost imperceptible kink in his line. Weakness? That was all I needed. I turned the column. The march became a charge. We hit the Persian flank not as a regiment, but as a force of nature. We drove inward, toward the center, toward the one spot where every Persian eye was fixed, the chariot of the great king himself. The fighting was even fiercer than at Granicus. This was the royal guard, the immortals. They died well, but we were an avalanche, and they were trees. I caught glimpses of Darius, a tall, stately figure in a gilded chariot, his face a mask of imperial shock that slowly crumbled into terror. The sheer press of my charge, the ferocity of my Macedonians was unimaginable to him. He saw his bodyguards dying around him. He saw me, getting closer, my armor spattered with blood, my eyes fixed on him. The great king of Persia, the king of kings, fled. He abandoned his army, his treasure, his very family, his mother, his wife, his daughters, all left behind in his luxurious camp. The victory was total. But as I walked through the opulent silken tents, past the weeping women of the royal harem, a different kind of conquest began to take shape in my mind. I entered the tent of Queen Statira and Sisygambis, Darius's mother. They knelt, expecting death or worse. I gently raised them. "Do not fear," I said, my voice soft, so unlike the roar of the battlefield. "You have lost a king, but you have gained a son. In my eyes you will hold the same honor as my own mother, Olympias." The old Queen Sisygambis looked from my face to the face of Hephaestion, who stood beside me, taller and in that moment calmer. She mistakenly knelt to him, thinking him the king. My companions gasped, but I merely smiled. "Do not worry, mother," I said, "for he too is Alexander." It was more than mercy. It was a new world order. At Granicus, I had proven my army's might. At Isseus, I had proven my own. But in that tent, I began to demonstrate my vision. I would not be a destroyer, like the crude Achilles. I would be a unifier. I would take the best of the West and the best of the East and forge them into something unprecedented. The empire I saw was not Macedonian, not Persian, but human. As I sit now, dictating these words, the scent of incense from a Persian brazier mixing with the smell of Macedonian leather, I think of Diogenes. He sought self-sufficiency in an empty jar. I seek it in the soul of an empire. He was free because he desired nothing. I will be free because I will understand everything. The canvas is vast, and the paint I see now. is not just blood and iron, but compassion, wisdom, and the audacious, unyielding belief that one man can reshape the world. And as you drift into sleep, remember, the greatest conquests are not of land, but of idea. The idea became a journey, and the journey became a trial. Leaving the aftermath of issues was like leaving a fever dream. The cheers of my men were a distant echo against the vast, silent expanse that stretched before us. We turned south along the coast of Phoenicia, and the world transformed. The rich earth of Anatolia gave way to a finer, more stubborn grain. Sand, it became the new constant, a relentless whisper in our boots, a grit in our teeth, a shimmering haze on the horizon. This, I realized, was the first true test of my new philosophy. An empire forged from will must first endure the attrition of the mundane. This was the sieving. Every step was a particle of the whole, every day a grain of sand passing through the hourglass of the campaign. The sun was an unforgiving smith, hammering us against the anvil of the coast. Men who had faced Persian scythe chariots without flinching now grumbled at the heat, at the endless rhythm of the march. They saw only the journey. I saw the weaving of a tapestry. Each city that yielded, Aradus, Byblos, Sidon, was another thread of colour, another culture welcomed, not crushed. I spoke with their priests, their merchants, their scholars. I learned their histories, their gods, their flows of trade. I was not conquering their lands. I was mapping their souls, finding where their streams of knowledge could merge with our Hellenic river. Then we came to Tyre. From the shore, it was a mirage of defiance. An island city a kilometre from the coast, its walls rising from the sea itself as if carved from the waves. It was a jewel of arrogance, a fortress that had laughed at the armies of Assyria and Babylon. Its ships were its walls, and the sea was its moat. They sent emissaries, offering pleasantries, but refused me entry to their city to sacrifice to their Heracles, whom they called Melkart. It was a subtle, yet absolute, denial. They would be a partner in trade, but not a subject in my world. They believed their island made them an exception to destiny. My generals, the ever-practical Parmenion among them, saw an impossible task. They advised we bypass it, that we leave this stubborn rock to its isolation. Blockade it, they said, and march on to Egypt. They saw a military problem. I saw an ideological one. To leave Tyre untouched would be to admit there were limits to my vision, that an island of resistance could exist in my ocean of unity. It would be a flaw in the canvas, a tear that would unravel everything. The world I envisioned had no islands, only points connected by the mainland of a shared future. If the mainland did not exist, I would build it. And so we began to sieve the sea itself. The command was so audacious, it bordered on madness. We would build a causeway, a mole of earth and stone, from the coast to the walls of Tyre. The men looked at me as if I had commanded them to drink the ocean. But belief is a contagion, and mine was absolute. We began with the ruins of old Tyre on the mainland, tearing down its buildings for stone. We drove stakes of cedar from the mountains of Lebanon into the seabed, creating a framework. Then the sand, thousands of men in a line stretching from the shore to the advancing edge of our new earth, past baskets of rock and sand, one to the other. As you listen, picture the scene not as a feat of engineering, but as a meditation. The rhythmic grunts of the men, the splash of stone into water, the creak of wooden cranes. Day after day the sun beat down, and the Tyrians taunted us from their walls and harassed us from their triremes. They saw men playing in the sand. I saw the physical manifestation of will. We were not merely building a bridge. We were erasing the very concept of separation. Each basket of sand was a denial of the word impossible. The work was slow, a grueling crawl. The sea fought back, its currents pulling at our foundations. The Tyrians sent fire ships, their hulls packed with pitch and sulphur, which crashed into our siege towers and set our work ablaze. The men despaired. I remember standing on the charred timbers of our mole, the smell of burnt wood and defeat thick in the air. Ptolemy, his face grimed with soot, looked at me, his eyes asking the question everyone was thinking, "When is it enough?" "We will build it wider," I said, my voice calm, though a storm raged within me. "We will build it of stone so solid that the sea will break against it, and fire will find no purchase." That was the turning point. It was no longer just a siege. It was a contest between the obstinance of man and the forces of nature. We dredged the sea floor, heaping silt and sand upon our ever-widening path. The fleets of Cyprus and Sidon, newly allied to my cause, arrived to form a blockade, neutralizing Tyre's naval advantage. My engineers, led by the brilliant Dyads of Pella, constructed new siege towers, monstrous wooden behemoths, 150 feet tall, moved to the very edge of the mole to rain down arrows and catapult stones upon the walls. For 7 months, we sieved the sand. For 7 months, we moved the earth. And then, one day, the final stone was laid. Our mole touched the walls of Tyre. The island was no longer an island. The impossible was now inevitable. The final assault was brutal, a release of pent-up fury. We breached the walls from the mole and from the sea simultaneously. The slaughter was immense. In the rage of victory, my men showed little of the mercy I had shown the family of Darius. I did not stop them. Tyre had not just resisted, it had scorned the very idea of my world. It had chosen pride over progress, and the price for such hubris is always steep. Thousands were slain, and the rest sold into slavery. I had 2,000 of its military-aged men crucified along the coast. A stark and terrible message to any who might still believe they were an exception. It was a dark, bloody stain upon my canvas, a necessary shadow to give the light its meaning. Compassion is a gift for those who would join the world, not for those who would defy its creation. From the ashes of Tyre, we marched on to Egypt. Here the sieving was different. The sand was not an obstacle, but a welcome. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, hailed me not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. They did not need to be forced to join my world. They opened their arms to it. In the Nile's fertile embrace, I found the affirmation I sought. I was not merely a warrior. I was a fulfillment of prophecy. This led me to one last journey through the sand, a personal pilgrimage. Across the Libyan desert, a sea of dunes far more formidable than the waters of Tyre, I went with a small contingent to the oracle of Siwa, a lonely oasis of profound antiquity. The desert stripped away everything: rank, army, ambition, leaving only the soul. The wind whispered secrets older than Macedon, older than Greece. And in the cool darkness of the temple, the priest of Ammon greeted me not as a king, but as a son, son of a god. The words settled, not with a clash of pride, but with the quiet weight of understanding. It was not a title to be worn like a crown, but a responsibility to be borne. If I was divine, it was because my vision was divine. My purpose was not my own. It was the will of history itself. And upon my return, I found the perfect place for this vision to take root. A strip of land between a lake and the She. Here, I drew the plans in the sand with my own hands. A city open to all, with wide streets, a library to hold all the world, knowledge, a lighthouse to guide ships from every corner of the earth. Alexandria, it would not be a capital of conquest, but a capital of culture, of thought, of commerce. It was the antithesis of Tyre's defiant isolation. It was the first true city of my new world, built not on a foundation of stone moved to conquer, but on an idea of minds coming together to create. The long march through the sand had sieved us all. It had broken the weak, hardened the strong, and clarified my purpose. From the brute force of the mole at Tyre to the intellectual grid of Alexandria, the journey had taught me that to shape the world, you must first be willing to move its very earth, whether it be sand, stone, or the stubbornness of the human heart. And now, as the night deepens around you, let your own thoughts drift. The challenges that seem like impassable islands in your life are merely waiting for the causeway of your will. Sleep now, and dream of causeways to your own islands of impossibility. The sand is there. You need only begin to move it. Sleep, you say? Sleep is a harbor for other men, a quiet port where they can reef their sails and forget the sea. For me, it has become another ocean. The dreams of causeways you speak of are not gentle things. They are visions of Gaugamela, of the Indus, of a world stretching to the rising sun, and the sand I must move is the dust of nations. The night after I traced Alexandria's form upon the earth, I did not sleep. The sea breeze, cool and salted, carried whispers that were not of Egypt. They were older. They spoke of Ammon, the hidden one, whose voice echoed from the heart of the Libyan desert. My new city was a testament to the mind of man, a grid of logic and commerce laid upon the shore. But a king does not rule by logic alone. An empire is not held together by wide avenues and well-stocked libraries. It is bound by something more primal, a story, a myth that takes root in the hearts of its people. I had proven myself a son of Philip, a master of strategy and steel. But in Egypt, they called their pharaoh the son of Ammon-Ra. To rule this ancient land and the world that lay beyond it, I knew I could not simply be a Macedonian king. I had to become an idea, as eternal as the gods they worshipped. My companions, my loyal generals, thought it madness. Ptolemy, ever the pragmatist, laid out the maps. "Alexander," he said, his finger tracing a vast emptiness, "this is not the sea. There are no shores here, no landmarks. The sun is the only god in that waste, and it is a jealous one. We will be lost. We will die of thirst." I saw the truth in his eyes, but also the limits of his vision. He saw a map of sand, saw a pilgrimage route. "We build causeways to impossible islands, Ptolemy," I reminded him, the words tasting of ash and prophecy in my mouth. "This is but another." The march from the coast was a descent into a silent, ochre hell. The sun was not a source of light, but of physical weight, a golden hammer that beat down upon our helmets and our spirits. The world was stripped of all complexity, reduced to two elements, the shimmering, hostile air and the endless, yielding sand. The sand became our true enemy. It crept into our armor, our food, our eyes. It mocked our progress, filling our footprints almost as soon as we made them. It was the physical manifestation of futility. The men's morale frayed. The strong veterans who had shattered the walls of Tyre and stood firm against Persian chariots began to mutter, their eyes wild with thirst and fear. They were soldiers, not mystics. They understood foes they could meet with a sarissa's point, not this whispering void. Our water skins ran low, then emptied. The guides lost their way. We were adrift on a sea of dunes. It was then, in our moment of greatest despair, that the myth began to right itself. As I watched my men, their lips cracked and blackening, a profound calm settled over me. I felt not the panic of a lost commander, but the focus of a man approaching the core of his question. Was I merely Philip's son, destined to die of thirst in this God's-forsaken wasteland? Or was there something else in my blood, a fire that could not be quenched by this mortal sun? The sky answered. Clouds dark and bruised gathered from nowhere in the brassy heavens. A storm in the heart of the desert. Rain began to fall, not a drizzle, but a deluge, as if a river in the sky had burst its banks. The men cried out, turning their faces upwards, catching the life-giving water in their mouths, their helmets. It was a miracle, was a sign. As the rain subsided, 2 crows, black as polished obsidian, appeared before us. They did not fly away. They circled, cawed, and then began to fly low, leading us westward. When we stopped, they would wait. When we marched, they would guide us. Ptolemy looked at me, his pragmatic doubts washed away by the rain and the impossible birds. He saw not a general gambling with his army, but a man in communion with the divine. The arrival at the Siwa oasis was like stepping from the land of the dead into a dream of paradise. After the endless, featureless sand, the sudden explosion of green was a shock to the senses. Tens of thousands of date palms rustled in a gentle breeze, their fronds a canopy against the sun we had grown to hate. The air was thick with the scent of olives and the sound of cool, running water. This was the seat of Ammon, and its power was palpable. It was a place where the gods still touched the earth. I approached the temple alone. The priests of Ammon, their heads shaven, their linen robes immaculate, met me not as a conqueror, but as one who was expected. Their high priest, a man whose eyes seemed to hold the memory of centuries, greeted me at the threshold of the inner sanctum. He looked past my armor, past my fame, and deep into the core of my being. His lips parted, and he spoke in his native tongue, but the greeting was meant for me alone. My companions later told me he hailed me as son of Ammon. But what I heard was not a title. It was a confirmation. He led me into the darkness of the Aditon, the Holy of Holies, a place forbidden to all but him and the god. The air was thick with incense, cool and still. There was no grand oracle, no booming voice from the heavens. There was only the silence and the weight of ages. I asked my questions, speaking them into the gloom. Questions about my father, my destiny, the limits of my reach. The answers came not in words, but in a profound sense of understanding that bloomed within me, as surely and as suddenly as the oasis had bloomed from the desert. I learned that Philip was my father, yes, but that a greater father had also claimed me. I learned that my path was my own to forge, yet its destination was already known to the gods. I learned that my empire would have no worldly boundary. The paradox did not trouble me. Had walked through the desert and been saved by a storm. I had been guided by crows. I was beginning to understand that the world of men and the world of gods were not separate realms, but intertwined, and I was the thread that bound them. When I emerged from the temple back into the light, the sun no longer felt like an enemy. It was a patrimony. The world looked different, sharper. My men saw it in my eyes. I had not gone into the desert to conquer a piece of land, but to conquer the final doubt within my own soul. I had built a causeway across my own fear, my own mortality, and on the black other side I had found not an island, but a continent of divine purpose. Alexandria was the city for the world I was building. Siwa was the coronation of the man who would build it. One was a work of the mind, the other a forging of the spirit. Both were necessary. Now the sand of Persia awaits. Darius gathers his forces for a final stand. He believes he fights a Macedonian king, a mortal man. He is wrong. He fights an idea, born in Greece, hardened at Tyre, given a home at Alexandria, and anointed by a god in the heart of an impossible desert. He fights the son of Zeus Ammon. For him, there will be no rain. The winds that carried the desert sand of Siwa seemed to follow me to Persia, whispering of destiny. At Gaugamela, the world held its breath. I watched Darius arrange his scythed chariots, his immortals, the full weight of an ancient empire, and I felt not fear, but a magnificent calm. He was arranging pieces on a board whose rules I had rewritten. He saw a battlefield. I saw an altar. When my companion cavalry shattered his flank, it was not mere tactics. It was the inevitable collision of a rigid, brittle past with a fluid, molten future. The dust of that plain was the ash of his world, and the wind, my wind, scattered it to the four corners of the earth. Babylon opened its gates, a willing bride. Susa offered its treasures, but it was in Persepolis, the heart of the Achaemenid beast, that the final rite had to be performed. Surrounded by the soaring columns and stone reliefs of 100 conquered kings, I felt the ghosts of Athens and Thermopylae at my back. To some, my putting the torch to that magnificent city was an act of drunken rage, a barbaric requital. They were wrong. It was a cleansing. An empire built on hubris must be consumed by a fire born of divine will. As the cedar beams cracked and the tapestries of history turned to smoke, I was not destroying. I was clearing the ground. A new world needed a new sun, and the old shadows had to be burned away. I was at the apex, the master of all I surveyed, the son of Zeus Ammon triumphant. My ambition was a star, and the sky had no limit. But the world is larger than a single sky. Beyond the Zagros Mountains, beyond the last Persian satrapies, the earth began to change. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of strange blossoms and wet soil. The horizon, once a clean, sharp line drawn across sand and rock, became a fuzzy, indistinct curtain of green. This was Bactria, Sogdiana, the lands that bled into the great mystery men called India. Here the fighting was different. It was not the grand theatre of Gaugamela, but a war of shadows and whispers, of mountain ambushes and poisoned wells. The enemy did not stand in orderly lines. They melted into the landscape, becoming one with the rocks and ravines. My Macedonians, the men who had broken the sacred band of Thebes and scattered the armies of Darius, began to murmur. The heat was a physical enemy, a weight on their shoulders. Strange fevers took them in the night, and the familiar stars of home vanished from the sky, replaced by alien constellations. They had conquered the known world. What, they asked, lay in this unknown one? I spoke to them of glory, of reaching the Eastern Ocean, of marching to the very edge of the world, where the gods themselves walked. I showed them my own scars, the map of our shared journey written on my flesh. They followed. For a time my will was still stronger than their weariness. Then we crossed the Indus. It was like stepping from the world of men into a land of myth. The rivers were wide as seas, and the rains came not as a blessing, but as a deluge, a sky-born ocean that fell for months without cease. The world dissolved into a morass of mud. Our armor rusted, our leather rotted, and the very ground beneath our feet seemed determined to swallow us whole. And there were stories, carried on the humid wind, of the kings who ruled these lands, of armies that did not count their men, but their elephants. At the river Hydaspes, we met Porus. He was a king in the old sense, a giant of a man who looked at me not as a god, but as a rival. And with him he brought the legends to life. The elephants, they were nothing like the beasts we had seen trotted out for ceremony in Persia. These were war towers of living flesh, with eyes of ancient intelligence and hides that could turn a sarissa. They moved with the earth-shaking tread of geological forces. Their trumpeting calls a sound, torn from the throat of some primordial nightmare. The battle was not a contest of tactics. It was a struggle against nature itself. The river, swollen and furious, fought us. The mud fought us. The elephants, they fought us with a terrifying fury. I saw horses, brave chargers who had faced down chariots, scream and bolt at the sight and smell of them. I saw a beast wrap its trunk around a Macedonian infantryman, lift him into the air, and dash him to pieces against the ground. For the first time, I saw true, soul-deep terror in the eyes of my veterans. This was not war, as we knew it. This was an affront to the natural order, a battle against monsters from a forgotten age. We won. We bled, we broke, and we paid a price in blood and spirit that made the sands of Gaugamela seem a pittance. But we won. My own Bucephalus, my sole companion since boyhood, was mortally wounded in the fray, his death a wound in my own heart. I honoured Porus, for a man who could command such a force and fight with such courage was no mere barbarian. I made him my ally, a king in my new world. But the victory felt different. It was hollow, resonant with the screams of my men and the ghosts of their fear. The divine purpose that had burned so brightly in the desert felt distant. The thread connecting me to the gods felt frayed, strained by the sheer brutal weight of this new, impossible land. We marched on, or rather I willed us on. The men followed, but their steps were heavy. Their gazes were turned not to the east and the promise of glory, but to the west, to the memory of wives and children and the scent of Macedonian soil. The monsoon was relentless. Every river was another Hydaspes, every jungle another beast to be tamed. The stories grew wilder of the Nanda Empire, with armies of hundreds of thousands, thousands more of those terrible elephants, waiting for us by the great river Ganges. Finally, at the banks of the Hyphasis, the unraveling was complete. The river was a brown, churning barrier, but the true barrier was before me. My army, my companions, my Pezetyroi, my Macedonians. They stood in the rain, their faces streaked with mud, their eyes empty of ambition. I called them together. I stood before them, on a makeshift platform, the rain plastering my hair to my brow, and I gave them the fire that was left in my soul. I spoke of Oceanus, the end of the world. I spoke of their immortal fame, of riches beyond imagining. I reminded them of our shared journey, from the shores of Greece to this, the cusp of the final mystery. I commanded, I pleaded, I raged. I was met with silence, a silence more terrible than any battle cry. It was a silence born of absolute exhaustion, a wall built of weary flesh and broken spirits. Then Coenus, one of my most loyal generals, a man who had bled for me a dozen times, stepped forward. He did not speak of cowardice. He spoke of mothers without sons, of wives without husbands. He spoke of the ghosts who marched beside us, the thousands we had left behind in the dust of 3 continents. He spoke of home, and when he finished, the silence was broken by a sound that shattered my world, the sound of weeping. Not from one man, but from hundreds. The toughest fighting force the world had ever known. The men who had conquered an empire stood in the Indian rain and wept for home. I retreated to my tent, a fortress of canvas against the mutiny of their hearts. For 3 days I stayed there, waiting for the shame to bring them back to me. Surely they would relent. I was Alexander, the son of Zeus Ammon. My will was the will of the cosmos. But no one came. The army waited, a vast, silent, and immovable wait. On the 3rd day, I emerged. I had walked through deserts and been saved by storms. I had conversed with gods. I had remade the world. But I could not take one more step east. The thread that bound the divine to the mortal, the thread that was me, had reached its limit. It could not pull the weight of so much human longing. My empire, I finally understood, did have a worldly boundary. It was not a river, or a mountain, or an ocean. Was the human heart. I gave the order. We would build altars to the gods, mark the extent of our journey, and turn back. A cheer went up, a sound of such profound relief that it was like a physical blow. They were celebrating my defeat. And in that moment, standing in the mud at the edge of the world, I felt the first true chill of mortality. The apex was behind me. The long, slow decline had begun. We were going home, but I knew, with a certainty that froze my soul, that I was not the same man who had left it. The journey back began not with a march, but with an act of monumental vanity. We built 12 great altars of stone, facing east, one for each Olympian god, as if to placate the very deities whose favor I now felt slipping through my fingers like fine sand. They were taller than any siege tower, monuments to a border I had not chosen. My men worked with a feverish energy they had not shown for the campaign in months. They were not building a testament to our glory. They were building the gravestone of my Eastern dream. As I watched the final stones being set, I saw them not as altars, but as 12 judges, a silent, stony jury, condemning my ambition for having flown too near the sun. We turned our ships south, down the Hydaspes. The river, which should have been a triumphant avenue bearing us home to glory, felt instead like the Styx, ferrying shades back from a failed quest. The men sang, their voices echoing off the jungle-choked banks. They were hymns of relief, songs of wives, and fields they had thought, never to see again. I sat in the stern of my flagship, Bucephalus' hide draped over my seat, and the sound of their joy was a grating torment. Each note was a reminder of my capitulation. I, who had bent Persia to my will, who had untied the Gordian knot with a sword. A stroke had been unravelled by the simple, homesick tears of my own soldiers. A new kind of fire began to burn in me then, a cold and bitter flame. If I could not conquer the world's land, I would conquer their wills through hardship. If they wanted to go home, they would earn it through a crucible of my own design. The world would not remember Alexander as the king who turned back. They would remember the return itself as a feat more terrible and magnificent than any conquest. I would make the journey home a new kind of war, a war against nature, against exhaustion, against the very concept of retreat. This dark resolve found its first outlet against the Malians. They were a proud, defiant people who had the misfortune of living along our new bitter path. I threw myself into the campaign with a fury that bordered on madness. Was not strategy, it was exorcism. I needed to wash the shame of the Hyphasis from my soul with blood. At the wall of their strongest city, a sudden rage, black and total, seized me. My generals urged caution. The men hesitated. In that moment, I saw their hesitation as the same weakness that had turned us back from the dawn. I would show them what a singular will could achieve. Grabbing a ladder, I was the first to scale the wall. For a breathless moment, I stood alone atop the battlements, a single man against a city. It was a perfect image of my entire life. Then, with a scream that was a prayer to Ares and a curse upon my own men, I leapt down. Alone, the moments that followed were a maelstrom of bronze and terror. I was Achilles. I was Heracles. I killed until my arms were leaden, my shield a splintered wreck. They swarmed me, their faces a blur of hatred. Then came the pain. It was not the clean, hot pain of a sword slash. It was a deep, tearing agony, a violation. An arrow, 3 feet long, had punched through my breastplate and buried itself in my chest, tearing through my lung. As I fell to my knees, gasping, the world dissolved into a red mist. I felt not the divine ichor of a god, but the hot, sticky, terrifyingly mortal liquid of my own blood filling my mouth. The son of Zeus Ammon was drowning in his own humanity. It was in that bloody dirt, with the taste of my own end on my tongue, that the chill I'd felt at the Hyphasis became a frozen certainty. The gods were not my patrons. They were my audience, and the tragedy was entering its final act. My men, shamed into action, finally broke through and saved the piece of me that was left, but they could not save the illusion. I had sought a god's death in battle, and they had dragged me back to a king's slow decay. My recovery was a torment, but it hardened my new resolve. Once I could stand, I led them not towards the verdant Persian plains, but south, towards the Gedrosian desert. My counselors pleaded with me. No army had ever crossed it. Cyrus the Great had lost almost his entire force there. Semiramis had returned with but 20 men. I listened to their warnings, and they sounded like a challenge. It was perfect. This desert was the physical embodiment of my soul, vast, barren, and inimical to life. They would walk through my heart to get home. The Gedrosian was a hell beyond imagining. The sun was not a source of life, but a celestial torturer, a bronze hammer that beat down upon us without mercy. The sand swallowed men, horses, and wagons. It got into our mouths, our eyes, our minds. Thirst became the only god, and we were its faithless supplicants. Men went mad, digging in the sand for phantom springs, their tongues swelling to fill their mouths. One day some scouts found a meagre puddle of brackish water, enough to fill a single helmet. They brought it to me, their faces cracked with sunburn and hope. They offered me their salvation. I looked at the precious liquid, shimmering in the battered helmet. I saw my reflection, a gaunt, bearded spectre with eyes that had seen the end of the world. Then I looked at the thousands of men watching me, their faces masks of suffering. The old Alexander, the leader of men, might have taken a sip and passed it on. The son of Philip, the king of Macedon, might have shared it with his closest companions. But I was neither of those men any more. With a steady hand, I poured the water onto the burning sand. It vanished in an instant. A hiss of steam, the only proof it had ever existed. A collective groan of despair rose from the army. I did not do it for them. I did not do it out of solidarity. I did it as an act of supreme and terrible pride. I was telling the desert, the gods, and my own men that I was the master of even this suffering. My thirst was greater than theirs, for it was not for water, but for a world I had been denied. I would not drink until we had conquered this wasteland. They would not drink because I willed it. It was the leadership of a tyrant, not a king. When we finally emerged from that sandy tomb, we were not an army. We were a procession of skeletons, ghosts haunted by the memory of sun and thirst. We had survived, but the bond between us was broken. They no longer looked at me with awe, but with a kind of terrified resentment. I had led them through hell not for glory, but for my own wounded pride. In Susa, I tried to stitch the fraying threads of my empire back together. I staged the mass weddings, marrying my generals to Persian noblewomen, myself taking 2 more wives. It was a political pantomime. I watched them feast, Macedonians and Persians in their finest silks, a forced smile on my face. I saw not a fusion of cultures, but a desperate lashing of 2 sinking ships together. I was no longer building an empire. I was merely trying to keep its pieces from drifting apart. The final unraveling came with Hephaestion. My friend, my other self, the one man who had been with me from the sun-drenched hills of Macedonia to the suffocating banks of the Hyphasis. He died of a fever in Ecbatana. When the news reached me, the world did not just crack, it shattered into dust. His death was the ultimate betrayal, not by a man with a knife, but by the mundane, grubby reality of mortal existence. A god's companion does not die of a fever. My grief was a monstrous thing, a force of nature. I crucified the doctor. I razed the local temple. I ordered the entire empire into mourning, silencing all music, extinguishing every sacred fire. I was trying to force the cosmos to acknowledge my pain. I planned for him a funeral pyre so vast it would rival the ziggurats of Babylon, a blaze that I hoped would consume my own sorrow. But even as the plans were drawn, I knew it was futile. Standing alone in my chambers, the silence of the grieving empire pressing in, I understood. The great unraveling was not about the borders of my empire or the loyalty of my men. It had happened inside me. The arrow, the desert, and now this final unbearable loss had scoured away the son of Zeus Ammon, leaving only Alexander, a man who had conquered the known world, only to find himself a stranger in it, irrevocably and utterly alone, with no more maps to follow, and no way back to the boy who had once believed he was immortal. The decline was no longer a fear. It was the air I breathed. The silence I had commanded was a new kind of desert, more vast and terrible than any I had crossed in Gedrosia. It was a vacuum that pulled at the edges of my sanity. In that quiet, every rustle of silk, every distant cough from a guard, sounded like a judgment. Hephaestion's voice was not just absent. Its lack was an active, malevolent presence. I would turn, expecting to see him leaning against a column, a wry smile on his lips, ready to temper my fury or share in a moment of triumph. But there was only empty, perfumed air. The empire I had built was now a tomb, and I had made myself its chief mourner and sole prisoner. My companions, my great generals, who had bled with me from the Granicus to the Indus, now walked on eggshells around this hollow god. In their eyes, I saw the shift. It was subtle at first, a flicker of something other than awe. Where once there was unwavering loyalty, now there was caution. Where there was shared ambition, now there was a guarded appraisal. They saw a man whose grief had become a form of madness, a king who ruled not by inspiration, but by the raw, brutal exercise of will. My sorrow was not a weakness they could pity. It was a weapon I wielded indiscriminately. Ptolemy, ever the pragmatist, his mind always cataloguing, now watched me as one might watch a collapsing star from a safe distance, calculating the trajectory of the debris. Perdiccas, whose ambition had always burned with a cold, clear flame, began to carry himself with a new straightness, as if testing the weight of a crown he did not yet wear. Craterus, the stalwart, the voice of the Macedonian old guard, grew quieter, his disapproval a stony silence that was louder than any shouted protest. They had followed a demigod who promised them glory. They were now tethered to a tyrant who promised only to share his own personal apocalypse. The plans for Hephaestion's pyre became my obsession. It was to be a structure of impossible scale, a mountain of cedar and cypress draped in gold and ivory, its tiers depicting the myths we had once lived. It was not a tribute to his memory. It was a desperate act of defiance against the gods, a monument to my own pain so large that even they could not ignore it. I drained the treasury, rerouted engineers from building cities to building this monument to an ending. When my generals questioned the expense, the sheer hubris of it, my rage was swift and terrible. He was worth more than all of you. I roared at them in the throne room in Babylon, the words echoing in the cavernous space. More than all of Persia's gold. You think in terms of logistics and coin. I think in terms of love and eternity. In that moment, I saw the last threads of camaraderie snap. They no longer saw their friend Alexander. They saw an Eastern despot draped in the silks of Darius, speaking a language of absolutes they could no longer understand. This was the seed of discord that took deepest root. To distance myself from the man I had been when Hephaestion lived, I plunged deeper into the persona of the great king of Asia. I began to wear the Persian diadem more often than the simple Macedonian causia. I insisted on proskynesis, the humbling prostration, not as a political tool to unify my empire, but as a balm for my wounded pride. Each time a grizzled Macedonian veteran awkwardly knelt before me, I felt a flicker of power that momentarily masked the gnawing emptiness. But I was only forcing them to kneel before my grief. It was an act of profound selfishness, and it created a chasm between me and the men who had been my bedrock. I was erasing the Macedonian king to forget the Macedonian friend I had lost. The nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only dreams of dust and fever. So I held court until dawn, turning the Babylonian palace into a vortex of sleepless activity. Wine became my closest confidant. The feasts grew more frantic, more debauched. They were not celebrations, but frantic attempts to fill the silence Hephaestion had left behind. I drank to forget the boy on the hills of Pella, the youth who believed in omens, the man who had wept at the tomb of Achilles. I drank to silence the mortal Alexander, who whimpered in the shell of the god. In the flickering torchlight, surrounded by laughing sycophants and wary generals, I would see Hephaestion's face in the crowd, and for a heart-stopping moment, the world would right itself. Then the illusion would dissolve, and the bitterness would return, sharper than before. I became cruel in my cups, my words finding the insecurities of my oldest friends and twisting the knife. I tested their loyalty by insulting it, daring them to break half, hoping they would, just so I could feel something other than loss. Even conquest, my oldest comfort, became a desperate flight. I pored over maps of Arabia, a land of sand and incense, planning a new campaign. It was motion for the sake of motion, a new war, to quiet the war inside me. I spoke of circumnavigating Africa, of reaching the Pillars of Hercules from the east. My ambition no longer had a destination. It was simply a need to keep moving, to outrun the ghost that followed me from Ecbatana. My generals saw the madness in it. They saw a king marching his exhausted army towards another desert, not for glory, but because he could not bear to stand still. Their veiled objections, their carefully worded concerns about supply, lines and morale were, to my paranoid mind, proof of their betrayal. They had lost the vision. They had lost faith. Then the fever came for me. It began, as it had for Hephaestion, as a simple chill during a long night of drinking with Medius. At first I ignored it, another mortal inconvenience to be conquered by will alone. But this enemy did not carry a spear. It was an insidious, internal foe, a mutiny in my own blood. As the fire in my veins grew, the world outside began to fade, replaced by a swirling delirium of memory and nightmare. The ziggurat of Babylon seemed to lean over my sickbed, its bricks whispering of my mortality. I saw the faces of Clytus, of Philotas, of all the men I had killed in my fury, their ghostly eyes judging me. My generals gathered around my bed. The masks were gone now. In the harsh light of my impending death, I saw them for what they were, wolves, circling. Ptolemy's calm face was a mask for a mind already claiming Egypt. Seleucus's sharp gaze was measuring the breadth of Asia. Perdiccas stood like a regent in waiting. They asked who I named as my successor, their voices thick with a feigned concern that barely concealed their rapacious hunger. The great dream of a unified world, of Hellenism spreading to the dawn, was already dead. It had died with Hephaestion, and I was merely its ghost. I looked at their avid, waiting faces, and a final bitter piece of my old self surfaced. The cunning, the strategist, the man who played with empires as if they were pieces on a game board. I would not give them the satisfaction of a clean succession. If my world was to unravel, let it be a magnificent catastrophe. I drew a breath that felt like swallowing hot sand, and whispered the words. That would become my final legacy, my last act of creation and destruction. To Kratistu, to the strongest. It was not a designation, was a curse, a spark thrown into a powder magazine. That moment, I knew the great unraveling was not my decline alone. It was the inheritance I left to the world. I had forged an empire with my ambition, and with my last breath I had shattered it, leaving the shards for lesser men to fight over, ensuring that the age of Alexander would be remembered not just for its impossible glory, but for the spectacular bloody chaos of its end. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since Ecbatana, the silence felt like peace. That final silence was not an end. It was a transition. My essence, untethered from the fever-racked shell that had been Alexander, became a spectator to the chaos I had willed. The peace I felt was the peace of the storm's eye, a momentary stillness before the winds I had unleashed began to tear my world apart. From this new, formless vantage, I watched them. Perdiccas, his hand still possessively on the signet ring he'd taken from mine, saw himself as the regent, the shepherd of a flock he intended to fleece. Ptolemy, ever the cautious calculator, his gaze was already distant, turning southwest towards the ancient, golden lands of the Nile, a prize worthy of a king, not a mere guardian. Seleucus, quiet and watchful, possessed an ambition that ran deeper and colder than the rest. He played a longer game. They were wolves, my magnificent wolves, and I had just thrown them the carcass of the world. The arguments began before my body was cold. The air, thick with incense and grief, curdled with conspiracy. "To the strongest," they repeated, the words echoing not with reverence for my will, but as a challenge, a starting pistol for the bloodiest race in history. They fought over my corpse, a gilded pawn in their opening moves. Should I be returned to the sacred soil of Macedon, or interred in the grand oasis of Siwa, acknowledging my divine parentage? Ptolemy, with cunning that would have made me proud, saw the answer. He stole my body, spiriting it away to Egypt, understanding that he who holds the founder's remains holds the symbol of legitimacy. It was the first great act of tearing, and the tapestry of my empire began to fray. I watched as my generals, my Diadochi, my successors, became warlords. They carved up my conquests like a feast, naming their bloody portions after themselves. The Antigonids, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies. They fought for 40 years, the wars of the successors, a grinding, relentless conflict that bled the veteran armies of Macedon dry across the plains of Asia. They murdered my mother, Olympias, that fierce and terrible woman. They murdered my wife, Roxana, and my son, the boy who should have been Alexander IV. They extinguished my bloodline to clear the board for their own ambitions. I had shown them how to conquer the world, and they used those lessons to conquer each other, shattering the vessel I had built. It was a magnificent catastrophe, just as I had wished. I saw my vision of a unified world, a single empire stretching from the Adriatic to the Indus, die in the mud of Ipsus and the dust of Gabiene. I felt a grim, hollow satisfaction. This was the legacy of the conqueror. This was the end of the age of Alexander. But I was wrong. As my spirit drifted, unbound by place or time, I began to see something else. The political body of my empire was being dismembered, but its soul, the very essence, what I had carried with me from Greece, was behaving like spilled wine. It was seeping into the ancient, thirsty soil of the East, staining it with a new, indelible color. My generals, in their vanity, founded cities and named them after me. Alexandria, Iskandaria, Ichanum. They built them in the Greek style, with a grid of streets, a theatre, a gymnasium, an agora. They were meant to be fortresses of Macedonian power, enclaves of the conquerors. But they became something more. They became laboratories of culture. I drifted through the streets of Alexandria in Egypt, the city Ptolemy was making the jewel of the world. I saw the great library rising, a testament not just to Greek learning, but to a hunger for all knowledge. Within its walls, scholars translated Egyptian histories, Babylonian astronomical, charts, and Hebrew scriptures into my language, into Koine Greek. The tongue of my soldiers, a simplified Attic dialect, had become the lingua franca of this new world. A merchant from Judea could now converse with a bureaucrat from Bactria, not in Aramaic or Persian, but in the language of Plato and Sophocles. This common tongue was a thread, invisible but unbreakable, stitching together the lands my successors were tearing apart. I travelled east, along the roads my army had marched. In the heart of what was once the Persian Empire, I saw young Persian nobles in the gymnasium, wrestling and discussing Zeno's philosophy, their minds as exercised as their bodies. I saw artisans in Susa sculpting reliefs that blended the austere grace of Phidias with the flowing, ornate traditions of Persepolis. The gods themselves began to mingle. Zeus was equated with Ammon-Ra in Egypt, and in the furthest reaches of the east, in Gandhara, I saw the first depictions of the Buddha. He was carved in stone by Greek-trained sculptors wearing a toga, his features serene and classical, with the protector deity Vajrapani rendered to look exactly like my own Heracles. It was a fusion I had never intended, a synthesis born not from a grand design, but from the simple daily friction of life. Soldiers taking local wives, their children growing up speaking two languages. Traders sharing stories and spices over cups of wine in sprawling new marketplaces. Philosophers debating the nature of the cosmos with magi and Brahmins. My brutal conquest had shattered the old world's walls, and in the rubble, something new and vibrant was growing. This was the Hellenistic age. It was not my empire, was its ghost. It was the echo of my passage. My generals fought over land, over gold, over the title of king. They believed strength was measured in phalanxes and territory. They had inherited my sword, but not my curiosity. They sought to rule the world I had won, but they did not understand the world I had made. The true strength, the one that answered my final riddle, was not in the arm that wields the spear. It was in the idea that outlives the spearman. It was in the shared language, the questions of philosophy, the marble forms, the logic, the drama, the very way of seeing the world that my people carried with them. This cultural inheritance was more invasive than any army, more enduring than any dynasty. The Roman legions that would one day march across these lands would find themselves conquering Greek cities, speaking to Greek-tongued officials, and ultimately falling captivated by the very culture they had subdued. They would take our gods, our architecture, our literature, and carry it even further to the misty shores of Britannia. My final words had been a curse, meant to unleash a war for political power. And it had, but in doing so, it had prevented my empire from collapsing into a monolithic, stagnant dominion. The chaos of the successors created a dozen competing kingdoms, each vying for cultural as well as military supremacy, each becoming a unique crucible for this new Hellenistic synthesis. My act of destruction had, ironically, become the ultimate act of creation. I no longer see myself as the man who died in Babylon. That man was a vessel, consumed by fever and ambition. I am the horizon he opened. I am the westward gaze in the eyes of a statue of a Bactrian king. The Greek inscription. On a coin found near the Indus, the ghost of Aristotle in the great library of Alexandria. The empires of my successors rose and fell, turning to dust just as my body had. But the world they bequeathed was one forever changed, a world where East and West had met, not just on the battlefield, but in the mind and in the soul. The great unraveling was not the end of my story. It was the violent, chaotic birth of my true and everlasting legacy. A legacy etched not in the borders of a transient empire, but in the timeless expanse of human culture itself. My name, once whispered with fear and awe from the Danube to the Indus, became something else entirely. It shed the skin of a mortal man and wore the raiment of a myth. My legend ceased to be a story and became a tool, a mirror, and a torment for those who came after. I became a fever in the blood of ambition, a ghost that haunted the dreams of kings and conquerors. I watched as a burgeoning, iron-willed republic on the Tiber began to cast its gaze eastward, its leaders devouring the accounts of my life like starving men. I was there, a phantom in the Spanish sun, when a young proconsul named Gaius Julius Caesar stood before a statue bearing my likeness. He was not yet the master of Rome, merely a man brimming with an ambition so vast it choked him. I saw the tremor in his hands and the sudden welling of tears in his eyes. His companions were perplexed, but I understood. I felt the echo of my own soul in his. He was not weeping for my triumphs, but for his own tardiness. At his age, I had conquered the known world, and he was yet a provincial governor. In my marble face, he saw not a hero to be emulated, but a benchmark he was failing to meet. That moment ignited a fire in him that would burn down the Republic and forge an empire. He and so many like him, Pompey, who styled himself Magnus in my shadow, Trajan, who stood at the shore of the Persian Gulf and lamented he was too old to follow my path to India. They did not merely study my campaigns. They sought to inhale my very essence, my pathos, that divine yearning for what lies beyond the horizon. They chased my ghost, and in the chasing became titans themselves, their legacies forever entangled with mine. But it was not just my fire they sought, it was my mind. My truest immortality was not cast in bronze, but was written in the grammar of warfare. I became a phantom ink on their maps, a silent instructor in their tents. The hammer and the anvil, the oblique advance, the synthesis of cavalry and infantry, these were no longer just the tactics of a Macedonian king. They became axioms of military science. I watched from the timeless ether as my strategies were reborn in different ages, clad in new steel and speaking new tongues. Centuries bled into one another, and a short, brooding Corsican pored over maps of my battles by candlelight. Napoleon. He traced my route through the Cilician gates, debated my decisions at Gaugamela, and saw the genius in the siege of Tyre. In his mind, the sarissas of my phalanx became the bayonets of the old guard, and the thunder of my companion cavalry was reborn in the devastating charges of his cuirassiers. He understood, as few did, that I conquered not just with men, but with speed, audacity, and an unbreakable will. He saw that logistics were the sinews of an army, and that morale was its soul. When he stood before the pyramids in Egypt, a land once ruled by my general Ptolemy, spoke to his men of history, it was my shadow that stretched longest in the fading light. He was the most brilliant of my students, yet he too learned my final lesson, that a dominion built solely on the force of one man's will is as fragile as a human life. He too would find his Babylon on a lonely island in the Atlantic. Yet the legacy of the sword and the scepter is, in the end, a fleeting thing. Empires crumble, dynasties fade. The most enduring conquests are those of the mind and the heart. The most potent part of my mythos began to bloom in the one place I had never fully conquered, the imagination of my enemies. In Persia, my great adversary, I did not remain the foreign destroyer. I was transformed. They took the conqueror, the Gajastak, the accursed, and slowly, through the rich loam of their poetry and storytelling, they remade me. I became Iskandar, a figure of romance and legend. In the verses of the Shahnameh and the tales of the Iskandarnameh, I was no longer just a Macedonian. I was a philosopher king who sought the water of life, a student of Aristotle, who debated with sages in India, a just ruler blessed by the divine. The Persians, in their infinite cultural wisdom, had conquered their conqueror. They consumed my history and assimilated it, making me a part of their own grand narrative. This, more than any victory at Iesius or Gaugamela, was the true Hellenistic synthesis I had dreamt of. My ghost no longer wore a Greek chiton, but the silken robes of a Persian epic hero. This new Iskandar travelled further than I ever did. He rode through the pages of manuscripts into the courts of Mughal emperors in India who claimed descent from me to legitimize their rule. He journeyed with traders and scholars along the Silk Road, my story a currency of its own. He became a character in Arabic folklore, a seeker of knowledge in Ethiopian texts. Each culture that touched my story added a piece of itself to me, polishing away the rough edges of the warlord and revealing the philosopher, the explorer, the myth. Artists, too, wrestled with my ghost, from the sculptors of Pergamum who captured the wild energy in my eyes, to the Renaissance masters who saw in me the ideal of classical man. I became a face for human potential. They painted me, not as the feverish man who died in Babylon, but as the triumphant youth entering it, the student sitting at the feet of my teacher, the hero whose gaze was perpetually fixed on the heavens. They immortalized not the man I was, but the idea I had come to represent, the audacious belief that the boundaries of the world and of human achievement were not fixed, but were merely invitations to be transgressed. The chaos I unleashed with my final words to the strongest was a fire that cleared the old world to make way for the new. The leaders who followed me were the great trees that grew in that clearing, their roots nourished by my story. The strategists were the architects who studied the patterns the fire had left on the land. And the artists and poets were the wind that carried the seeds of my legend to every corner of the earth, where they took root in foreign soil and blossomed into strange and beautiful new forms. I am not Alexander, son of Philip, who wept for want of new worlds to conquer. That man is dust. I am the echo of his ambition in the heart of Caesar. I am the blueprint of Gaugamela spread on Napoleon's table. I am the noble Iskandar, searching for immortality in a Persian poem. My true empire was never marked by garrison towns and satrapies. It is a boundless dominion of the human spirit, an empire of aspiration. It is etched not on stone or papyrus, but in the restless, yearning heart of humanity itself. I am the question that lingers long after the battle is over. The story is told, and the empires are gone. What lies beyond the known horizon? But that question, the one I left echoing in the halls of history, has a darker twin, a shadow that clings to the heel of glory. For every soul who looked to my star and felt the pull of the horizon, another was crushed beneath the wheels of my chariot. My empire of aspiration was built upon foundations of bone and watered with the tears of the conquered. Do not mistake this for repentance. A tempest does not repent for the ships it has broken, nor does a wildfire apologize to the forest it has consumed. I am that storm, that fire. To understand the light I cast, you must also acknowledge the stark and terrible shadows it carved into the world, the fire that cleared the way for new growth. It first had to burn. Remember Thebes. Before my name was a whisper in the Indus Valley. It was a scream in the streets of Boeotia. I was young then, fueled by a rage as pure and hot as a blacksmith's forge. They dared to question my ascendancy, to believe the eagle had fallen. I made of their city a monument to my certainty. I was not just a conqueror that day. I was an erasure. I heard the music of its history turning to ash, the wisdom of its libraries scattered to the wind. I commanded that the house of Pindar, the poet, be spared, a gesture the sycophants called merciful. But what is such mercy? It is the mercy of a wolf that leaves a single lamb to tell the story of the slaughter. I wanted the world to know that I could appreciate beauty, but I also wanted them to know with chilling finality that its survival depended entirely on my whim. I am the silence where Thebes once stood. My ambition was a bridge, they say, between East and West. A noble sentiment, but bridges are built with ruthless engineering. Look to the coast of Phoenicia. Look to Tyre, an island city, proud and defiant, a jewel on the seafoam. They closed their gates to me. They believed their god, Melkart, and their walls of stone would protect them. They believed in the sea, but my will was a force more elemental than the tide. The causeway I built to their gates, a scar upon the face of the Mediterranean, was paved not just with stone and timber, but with the stubborn pride of a people who dared to say no. For 7 months they watched the land creep toward them, a slow, inexorable finger of my wrath. When the walls fell, my fury was that of a frustrated god. The men were crucified along the shores, thousands of them, a forest of agony to greet the rising sun. The women and children were sold into the chains of slavery. I did not just conquer Tyre. I unmade it. I am the ghost of every man who hung upon that shore, his back to the city he died for, his face to the empire that devoured him. Even in triumph, the shadow grew longer, deeper. It coiled in the banquet halls and whispered in the haze of unwatered wine. In Persia, I stood before the throne of Cyrus, the tomb of a king I respected, a man who had built an empire through a vision of tolerance. I felt the weight of his legacy, and then I marched to Persepolis, the heart of that same empire, a city of such staggering beauty it seemed dreamt into existence. I let it burn. Why? The historians will give you reasons. Revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece a century and a half before. A symbolic act to declare the end of the Achaemenid dynasty. A drunken whim, goaded by a courtesan's whisper. The truth is, all of these are true, and none of them are. The philosopher in me, the student of Aristotle, warred with the barbarian who wore my skin. The king who envisioned a unified world fought the Macedonian general who still tasted the blood of Cheronea on his tongue. And that night in Persepolis, under a sky choked with the smoke of sculpted cedar and melting gold, the barbarian feasted. I held the torch, but it was the weight of my own legend that fanned the flames. The man had to be strong enough to carry the myth, and sometimes the myth demanded a sacrifice of impossible scale. I am the scent of burning history, the empty sockets in the eyes of the Lamasa statues that watched a civilization die. This shadow did not only fall on cities. It consumed the very men who helped me cast it. It consumed my own soul. I demanded a loyalty so absolute it became a form of blindness, and I punished any who blinked. Ask the ghost of Philotas, tortured and executed on suspicion. Ask his father, my most brilliant general, Parmenion, assassinated without trial because a son's perceived treason had to be ripped out by the root. These were not acts of strategy. They were the paranoid spasms of a man who was beginning to believe his own divinity and who could not suffer the presence of mortals who remembered him as anything less. And Clytus, my Clytus the Black, the man who saved my life at the Granicus, who knocked the PRH. Spara, a type of shield, from a Persian's hand as the axe fell. He was my memory, my anchor to the soil of Macedonia, and in a drunken rage, in the suffocating heat of Samarkand, I silenced him. He spoke the truth, that my victories were Macedonian victories that I was forgetting. The men who bled for me in my rush to embrace the silken prostrations of the East. His words were a mirror, and I shattered it. I plunged a spear, not just into the heart of a friend, but into the heart of my own past. My grief afterwards was monstrous, a pageant of self-loathing. But what good is the grief of a king who holds the bloody spear? It is just another story, another scene in the grand drama. I am the unforgivable word spoken in anger, the friendship murdered by pride. My boundless dominion of the human spirit is a poisoned chalice. To drink from it is to taste the nectar of possibility, but also the venom of absolute power. The ambition that drives a man to cross the Gedrosian desert also drives him to crucify his own soldiers for perceived failures. The vision that imagines a world without borders is the same that justifies raising a city that honors its own. The fire that forges a new era is the same fire that immolates the old. So when you feel that echo of my ambition in your heart, when you stand before your own horizon and ask, what lies beyond? Remember the other question, the one whispered by the ghosts of Tyre and Thebes, the one that lingers in the smoke of Persepolis, and the silence that followed my spear's withdrawal from the chest of Clytus. The true question is not just what lies beyond. It is what and who you are willing to burn to get there. Babylon, the city of gods and kings, of ziggurats piercing the heavens and canals that mirrored the constellations. It was here, in the heart of my meticulously crafted empire, that the final act of my earthly play was written, or perhaps, more accurately, unwritten. The breath that had fueled my conquests, that had driven me across burning sands and through the icy passes of the Hindu Kush, simply ceased. One moment, I was the embodiment of the divine will, my gaze fixed on the endless horizons of what was yet to come. The next, I was a mortal man, gasping for air I could no longer command. The whispers began almost before my last sigh had dissipated into the heavy Mesopotamian air. Treason, they muttered, their eyes darting nervously towards the shadows. Poison, the physicians hissed, their faces pale as they probed my failing body with their sterile instruments. A fever, the priests intoned, their voices designed to soothe but carrying the weight of unspoken fear. They spoke of the gods, of divine displeasure, of omens that had no doubt been conveniently observed in retrospect. But I, Alexander, the son of Zeus and Olympius, knew the truth, or at least I knew the absence of an easy truth, my boundless dominion of the human spirit, the very essence that had propelled me to the edges of the known world, had become a poisoned chalice. To drink from it was to taste the nectar of possibility, the intoxicating promise of a unified world, of Hellenic culture blossoming in the furthest reaches of Asia. But it was also to taste the venom of absolute power, the corrosive certainty that my will was the only law that mattered. The ambition that drove me to cross the Gidrosian desert, a feat that broke men and withered armies, also drove me to crucify my own soldiers for perceived failures, for a moment's hesitation on the battlefield. The vision that imagined a world without borders, a tapestry woven with threads of diverse peoples united under a single banner, was the same that justified razing Tyre to the ground, that saw Persepolis burn with a righteous fury. The fire that forged a new era, that illuminated the dark corners of ignorance with the torch of knowledge. Progress was the same fire that immolated the old world, its traditions, its stubborn pride, its very soul. So when you feel that echo of my ambition in your heart, when you stand before your own horizon and ask, what lies beyond? Remember the other question, the one whispered by the ghosts of Tyre and Thebes, the one that lingers in the smoke of Persepolis and the chilling silence that followed my spear's withdrawal from the chest of my dear Clytus. The true question is not just what lies beyond, it is what and who you are willing to burn to get there. And that is the mystery they try to solve in Babylon, in its suffocating heat and its teeming, watchful populace. They dissect my final hours, searching for a tangible culprit, a diabolical plot to be unraveled. Was it Antipater, eyeing the throne that would inevitably be vacant? Was it Olympias herself, ever the schemer, who perhaps saw my insatiable ambition as a threat to her own legacy? Or was it a more insidious enemy, a lingering wound from one of my countless battles, a slow-acting venom administered by a hand unseen, a consequence of 1,000 grudges festered over years of conquest? They probe the memories of my trusted generals, their faces a mask of grief and calculated loyalty. Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, Lysimachus, they were all there, their loyalties as shifting as the desert sands. Each had his own ambitions, his own fears, his own vision of what would come after Alexander. Did one of them, seeing the empire I had built teetering on the precipice of internal strife, decide that my continued existence was a threat to stability? Did they believe that my death, however tragic, was a necessary sacrifice to prevent the very chaos we had fought so hard to conquer? Perhaps the truth is simpler and far more agonizing for them to accept. Perhaps it was simply the culmination of a life lived at a pace that defied mortal limits. I pushed my body beyond endurance, my spirit beyond reason. I courted danger not out of recklessness, but out of a profound, almost desperate need to experience everything, to know everything. The burning sun of India, the icy winds of the north, the wisdom of the Persian magi, the ferocity of the Scythian horsemen. I absorbed it all, leaving no stone unturned, no culture unexamined, no enemy unchallenged. My fevers were often born of exhaustion, my ailments the consequence of wounds that never truly healed. And in Babylon, a city already saturated with ancient sicknesses and the detritus of empires, my body, finally worn thin by the relentless demands I had placed upon it, simply gave way. But that is too mundane a truth for myth, too stark a reality for the legends that will surely rise from my ashes. They will weave tales of divine intervention, of poisoned wine poured by the hands of jealous gods, of a jealous Isis, or a vengeful Marduk. They will speak of my growing hubris, of my insistence on being worshipped as a god, and how the heavens finally struck me down. They will invent conspiracies, weaving intricate webs of deceit and betrayal, attributing my demise to the machinations of men who were, in truth, merely struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what I had unleashed upon their world. My death, like my life, will be a canvas upon which others paint their own narratives. They will project their hopes and their fears onto the enigma of Alexander. Some will see the fall of a demigod, a cautionary tale of pride and unchecked ambition. Others will mourn the loss of a visionary, a man who dared to dream of a world united. His reign cut short before its true promise could be realized. And I, Alexander, the conqueror of worlds, the architect of dreams, the embodiment of a fire that consumed and created in equal measure, I will remain in Babylon, a silent observer of the unfolding drama. The mystery of my end is not a puzzle to be solved, but a mirror reflecting the complexities of power, the insatiable hunger of ambition, and the undeniable fact that even the greatest of fires eventually burns out, leaving behind only ashes and the enduring echoes of what once was. The poison, perhaps, was not in any chalice, but in the very immensity of the dominion I claimed, a dominion that ultimately proved too vast, too consuming, even for Alexander himself. The echoes of what once was, they did not wait for the smoke from my pyre to clear before they began to circle. The ashes, these men I had called my companions, my generals, my friends. They were wolves, magnificent and terrible, who had long tasted blood at my side, and now, with the Alpha fallen, scented a fresh, impossibly vast kill, the world itself. I linger in the gilded chambers of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, a shade tethered to the heart of the empire I had bled to create. My form is less than smoke, a cold spot in the sweltering Babylonian air, yet my consciousness is sharper than ever, unbound by the frailties of flesh and fever. I watch them, these titans of my own making, as they gather around the great table where we once planned. The conquest of Arabia, the circumnavigation of Africa, the endless march to the Eastern Ocean. Now they plan only the conquest of each other. It began with a question, whispered from the parched throat of Perdiccas as he leaned over my deathbed. "To whom do you leave your kingdom, Alexander?" My lungs were fire, my tongue a swollen stone. The legends will say I rasped, toi kratistoi, to the strongest. A perfect, terrible epitaph, a divine spark to ignite the world. Fire. Perhaps I did say it, or perhaps in my delirium. I mumbled the name of Craterus, my most trusted general, my intended regent, already marching with the veterans back to Macedonia. Krateroi. The difference of a single, breathy syllable, the hinge upon which history would turn and break. The truth, like my body, is now an artifact to be fought over, a relic to be claimed. In the end, it matters little. They heard what their ambition wanted to hear. They heard a challenge. Perdiccas, ever the steward, tried to hold the center. He was a capable man, but he sought to be the custodian of my dream, not the dreamer himself. He held up my ring, my sigil, as a shield against the coming storm, declaring the empire would be held in trust for my son, unborn Alexander IV, still nestled in Roxana's womb, and for my half, brother the simple-minded Philip III. A noble gesture, a fool's hope. He tried to bind wolves with promises. I watched Ptolemy, my clever, cautious Ptolemy. He was never a man for grand, sweeping gestures. He was a builder, a preserver. While others saw the entire map, Ptolemy's eyes were already fixed on Egypt. He saw the Nile, the ancient wealth, the defensible borders. He did not want the world. He wanted a kingdom he could hold, a legacy he could sculpt in stone and papyrus. His mind was a fortress, and he was already drawing up the gates. He feigned loyalty to the regency with a courteous smile, all the while calculating the logistics of stealing my corpse. For he knew a profound truth of this new age: Legitimacy was not just a matter of bloodline or appointment, but of possession. To possess the body of Alexander was to possess the mandate of the gods. Then there was Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, an old bull from my father's generation. Scarred and relentless, he saw the empire not as a delicate tapestry of fused cultures, but as a battlefield. Power for him was simple, the will of the strongest man, imposed by the longest spear. He looked at Perdiccas's careful arrangements with the contempt of a lion for a cage. He did not plot in whispers. His ambition was a roar that echoed from Phrygia across the plains of Asia. He wanted it all, and he believed, with the unshakable certainty of a born warrior, that he had the might to take it. And Seleucus, the quiet one, the commander of my hypaspists, he played the long game. While the others lunged, he waited. His gaze was always eastward, towards the vast, mysterious lands beyond the Euphrates, where I had seen the future. He understood that the heart of the empire was not in Babylon, or even in Macedon, but in the sprawling territories he would one day claim. He moved with a patient, serpentine grace, making alliances, gathering strength, a coiled spring of power, awaiting the perfect moment to strike. The first crack in their fragile peace was, fittingly, over me. My body, no longer a vessel for a soul, became the ultimate prize. The grand procession was prepared to carry my golden sarcophagus back to the royal tombs at Aigai in Macedonia. A sentimental journey home. But Ptolemy, my pragmatic Ptolemy, would have none of it. He saw the procession not as a funeral cortege, but as a moving symbol of imperial authority passing out of his reach. I watched, a helpless phantom, as his agents intercepted the procession in Syria. There was no grand battle, just a swift, decisive act of theft. He brought my body to Memphis, entombing it in honey to preserve it, a sacred talisman for his new dynasty in the land of the pharaohs. In that moment, the empire was irrevocably broken. It was not a declaration of war, but something far more profound, a declaration of inheritance. Ptolemy had not merely stolen a corpse. He had stolen a piece of my soul, sliver of my divinity, and planted it in the rich, black soil of the Nile. Perdiccas was forced to act. To allow such a transgression to stand was to admit his own powerlessness. And so he marched on Egypt, leading the imperial army not against the Persians or the Indians, but against Ptolemy, against my childhood friend. I stood on the banks of the Nile, an unseen shadow amidst the reeds, and watched my Macedonians, the unbeatable veterans of Issus and Gaugamela, drown in the treacherous currents as they tried to cross. I saw their despair, their anger, their mutiny. They had followed me to the edge of the world, but they would not follow Perdiccas to a civil war for the sake of a stolen tomb. His own officers murdered him in his tent. Seleucus was among them, his dagger striking not with passion, but with cold political necessity. The regency was dead, and with it, the last ghost of unity. The news of Perdiccas's fall was not a balm, but gasoline on the fire. The wolves were unleashed. Antigonus roared and seized Asia Minor. Seleucus, for his role in the mutiny, was rewarded with the satrapy of Babylon, the very heart from which he would build an empire, stretching to the Indus. In Greece, the old lion Antipater and his son, the ruthless Cassander, wrestled for control of the homeland, their machinations, eventually leading to the murder of my mother, Olympias, my wife, Roxana, and my young son, Alexander IV. They extinguished my bloodline, hoping to extinguish my legacy. But they do not understand. My legacy is not my son, nor is it the unbroken expanse of my conquests on a map. That was the vessel, the fleeting physical form. My true legacy is the fire I cast into the world, the Hellenic fire that now burns in 100 different hearths. They have shattered the great mosaic of my empire. Yes, but each of them has run off with a handful of the brilliant tiles. Ptolemy builds a new Alexandria, a beacon of learning that will outshine Athens. Seleucus found cities across the east, seeding Greek culture where no European had dared to tread. Even Antigonus, in his brutal pursuit of absolute power, spreads the language and customs of my people. They are tearing my world apart to remake it in their own images. They are the Diadochi, the successors. They fight for the pieces of my dream, and in doing so they ensure that the dream itself, though fractured, will never truly die. I, Alexander, am no longer a king. I am an idea. I am a fever in the blood of ambitious men. I am a ghost watching the violent, glorious, and terrible birth of a new age from the ashes of my own. The night has embraced me, and now its shadow falls over my children, who will spend their lives warring for an inheritance too vast for any one of them to claim. But that is too mundane a truth for myth, too stark a reality for the legends that will surely rise from my ashes. They will weave tales of divine intervention, of poisoned wine poured by the hands of jealous gods, of jealous Isis, or of vengeful Marduk. They will speak of my growing hubris, of my insistence on being worshipped as a god, and how the heavens finally struck me down. They will invent conspiracies, weaving intricate webs of deceit and betrayal, attributing my demise to the machinations of men who were, in truth, merely struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what I had unleashed upon their world. The news of Perdiccas's fall was not a balm, but gasoline on the fire. The wolves were unleashed. Antigonus roared and seized Asia Minor. Seleucus, for his role in the mutiny, was rewarded with the satrapy of Babylon, the very heart from which he would build an empire stretching to the Indus. In Greece, the old lion Antipater and his son, the ruthless Cassander, wrestled for control of the homeland, their machinations eventually leading to the murder of my mother, Olympias, my wife, Roxana, and my young son, Alexander IV. They extinguished my bloodline, hoping to extinguish my legacy. But they do not understand. My legacy is not my son, nor is it the unbroken expanse of my conquests on a map. That was the vessel, the fleeting, physical form. My true legacy is the fire I cast into the world, the Hellenic fire that now burns in 100 different hearths. They have shattered the great mosaic of my empire. Yes, but each of them has run off with a handful of the brilliant tiles. Ptolemy builds a new Alexandria, a beacon of learning that will outshine Athens. Seleucus found cities across the east, seeding Greek culture where no European had dared to tread. Even Antigonus, in his brutal pursuit of absolute power, spreads the language and customs of my people. They are tearing my world apart to remake it in their own images. They are the Diadochi, the successors. They fight for the pieces of my dream, and in doing so they ensure that the dream itself, though fractured, will never truly die. I, Alexander, am no longer a king. I am an idea. I am a fever in the blood of ambitious men. I am a ghost watching the violent, glorious, and terrible birth of a new age from the ashes of my own. The night has embraced me, and now its shadow falls over my children, who will spend their lives warring for an inheritance too vast for any one of them to claim. Oh, how they war! From my eternal, silent vantage, I watch as the world I stitched together with blood and will unravels and reknits itself into a tapestry of conflict. They are like boys fighting over my armor, each piece too large, too heavy for any one of them. Antigonus One Eye, his ambition as vast as his girth, bellows for unity, for a single empire under his own fist. He does not seek to rebuild my dream. He seeks to build his own atop its grave, and opposing him, a web of shifting alliances and bitter rivalries. Ptolemy, the cleverest of them all, sits ensconced in Egypt, my body, my physical anchor to this world, now a political pawn in his sarcophagus in Memphis. He does not march to conquer the world. He builds a library to contain it. He understands that knowledge is a subtler, more enduring form of power than the sword. He guards my corpse as a talisman, even as he cultivates a new kind of kingdom in the Nile's embrace. And Seleucus, the shrewd satrap of Babylon. He lost his city, fought to regain it, and now carves a realm so vast it dwarfs the Macedonia of my youth. He plants my cities like seeds, Seleucia, Antioch, 100 others, and from them sprout not just Greek agoras and gymnasia, but a strange, vibrant hybrid. He marries a Bactrian princess, Apama, and their son will be a king of both worlds. This is something new. This is not the pure Hellenic fire I imagined, but a fiercer, more complex flame. It is the fusion I began at Susa, the wedding of East and West, playing out not as a single decree from a king, but as the organic, messy work of generations. I see Cassander, his soul a small, dark thing, pacing the halls of Pella. He builds a new city, Thessaloniki, named for my sister, a hollow attempt to claim a piece of my mythos, after he murdered the living parts of my family. He thinks by erasing my blood, he erases me. He is a man who mistakes genealogy for Genesis. He does not see that the idea has already escaped the confines of my lineage. The great crashing battles between these titans, ipsus corrupedium, are like earthquakes that reshape the continents of their power. The old world of city-states and Persian satrapies is gone, ground to dust beneath the tread of their phalanxes. In its place rise kingdoms, personal domains held together by the strength and charisma of one man. They are all, in their way, pale reflections. They imitate my tactics, adopt my titles, even deify themselves in my shadow, but they lack the unifying vision. They are architects of their own palaces, not of a new world. And yet in their fractured, bloody competition, they achieve what a single, stable empire might never have. Ptolemy's museum and library in Alexandria become the brain of the world, where Aristarchus posits that the earth revolves around the sun, where Euclid defines geometry, where the Septuagint is translated. My general, in seeking to glorify his own rule, inadvertently builds a lighthouse for all human thought. Seleucus and his descendants fill Asia with Greek art, drama, and philosophy, which twists and melds with the profound spiritual depths of the East. Buddhas in Gandhara will one day bear the graceful Hellenic folds of my sculptors. The Stoics will preach a philosophy of cosmopolitan citizenship that would have been unthinkable before I bound the fates of so many peoples together. The very language of my homeland becomes the lingua franca of trade and scholarship, the vessel, through which a Judean preacher named Paul will one day spread a new gospel across my old empire. They fight for the shadow of my crown, but in doing so, they sow the seeds of my true purpose everywhere. I wanted one world, united. They have given me 100, each cross-pollinated with the spirit of the other. It is not the tidy, glorious unity I envisioned from the throne of Darius. It is chaotic, imperfect, and stained with blood and betrayal. But it is alive. It is dynamic. It is real. This is the lesson that eludes them as they march and scheme. Greatness is not a territory to be held, but a catalyst to be released. A leader is not defined by the borders he maintains, but by the change he unleashes. A legacy is not a monument, but a current in the river of time, forever altering the landscape it flows through. They look at the broken empire and see my failure. I look at the blossoming Hellenistic world and see my ultimate, unintended success. My life was the stone cast into the pond. Their wars are the ripples, spreading ever outward, touching shores I never knew existed. As the silence of the ages settles around me, the clamour of their battles fading into a distant echo, I feel not regret, but a strange, quiet satisfaction. The night has embraced me. Yes, but I am not its prisoner. I am its witness. I am the dream that outlived the dreamer. The fire is loose, and it will not be put out. And so, as you drift towards sleep, ponder this: the pursuit of greatness is not a path to a destination, but the act of setting something in motion that is greater than oneself. It is to become a question that future generations must strive to answer. My question was, what can one man, burning with a single vision, achieve? The answer, woven from the triumphs and tragedies of my successors, from the libraries of Alexandria to the colonnades of Seleucia, is this: he can achieve nothing lasting alone, but he can spark everything. The world I left behind was not an end, but a violent, fertile, magnificent beginning. And in the quiet of the night, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of the shattering, a sound not of death, but of a universe being born.